Hello Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We're here to talk about your not one but two new books that we published with us at Packt very shortly, which are C#11 and .NET 7 Modern Cross-Platform Development Fundamentals, as well as Apps and Services with .NET 7. Tell us a little bit about your journey as an author so far. How did it start and what prompted you to start sharing knowledge?
Well, it's been quite a while now. I was first approached by Packt back in 2015. And I was asked whether I wanted to write a book about C# and games, writing games for it. And at the time I was doing a lot of boot camp training courses. So people would arrive and I would give them really intensive training. They would get certified, pass the Microsoft exams. At the time, you could actually take an exam on C# and .NET. And so I'd help them prepare and get passed and get qualified. And so I'd already had a lot of experience working with enterprise developers who are spending all day building websites and maybe some mobile apps, typically for use within the organization. And so they need productivity. They need to get things done quickly and easily. And that's why they often use C# and .NET, because it's a great general purpose language that can create pretty much everything. Even these days, things like VR and AR type applications. So I was approached by Packt back in 2015 to write this book. And so I actually suggested, look, Microsoft is just about to release a new type of .NET. They've rewritten it, it's .NET Core, and that's going to come out early in 2016. So I'd much rather write a book about .NET Core, this new modern development platform. And I felt that was an opening as well, because there's a lot of books. If you go onto Amazon or Packt's website, there are lots of books on C# and .NET. So it's like, well, what can I do to make a contribution to that market? And my skill is particularly helping students or enterprise developers get quickly up to speed, because I can look at some new technology, some new feature of a technology or some new platform, learn it myself. And by going through that process myself of that learning, I then realize the best way to then teach that to someone else. And so I've been doing that for a long time in the classroom, for everyone from apprentices, 16-year-old apprentices, up to 60-year-old 70-year-old retirees who just want to build their own little apps as a kind of hobbyist type thing, and they can all benefit from the way that I teach. And I put that into my books every time. So yes, we released a few editions over the years, and because Microsoft has now settled into a annual release cycle for .NET every November, typically the first or second week of November, they'll release the next major version of .NET. And so we try very hard, myself and the Packt team, we work really hard over that summer to make sure that we can deliver a great book that covers all the new topics in time for that .NET Conf event in November, when Microsoft then releases that major version. And it's worked really well, and we get great feedback from readers.
That's absolutely amazing to hear. So you've mentioned you've written quite a lot of books for Packt already. So what motivates you to keep coming back and working on a brand new, better edition of your books every year?
It helps that Microsoft releases major versions with lots of cool new stuff in it. So every year you've got something new to learn, something new that's going to make you much more productive as a .NET developer. It doesn't always have to be a major new thing, but for .NET 7 this November, probably for most people, I think that new thing probably is going to be .NET MAUI, even though it has been available now for a few months running on .NET 6. I think most people will start to look at it with .NET 7. And so that's why that's going to be a few of the bigger chapters in my apps and services with .NET 7 book. 2 of those chapters out of the 20 will be covering .NET MAUI. It's a cool new platform for building cross-platform graphical user interface apps. So you can build a single project instead of having to have separate projects for all the different platforms. You've now got a single project, and it can target iPhone, it it can target Android, it can now also target desktop, so Windows and Mac OS. One project, 4 different platforms. In fact, there is a 5th, Tizen, from Samsung. You can also target that platform as well, but I think primarily it's the 2 desktop and the 2 mobile platforms that most people will be interested in. And so an enterprise developer can build these really nice looking graphical app that can then run across all of those platforms, and then all of the employees within the organization can benefit. And it's really quick, easy to do. So that's a big new feature that I think a lot of people will be very interested in. But even the small features, the thing that motivates me almost more than anything else are the new language features. So in C#11, for example, it sounds really simple, but every project that you're ever going to write, you're going to need to create a piece of text. Now that might be in XML format or JSON, JavaScript object notation format, or some kind of special format. And you'll probably need within that some special characters that you traditionally need to use, backslashes to escape them, all this kind of stuff. And it just becomes a real mess. And then when you go back and try and interpret what you're writing there, it can be very difficult to read. And so in C#11, we now have what are called raw literal strings. And what that means is that you, instead of starting and ending a string with a single double quote character, you now start it with 3 or more. So if I start a string with 3 double quotes, I can now just type in anything I like. If I need to have 2 double quotes next to each other, it'll just interpret that as 2 double quotes, or every special character is treated as those characters. So it looks exactly as you're actually going to use it. And then you just end it with 3 double quotes. Now you might think, but what if I need 3 double quotes in the middle of that string, in that middle of that text block? Well, use 4 double quotes to begin and end, or 5 or 6 or however many you need. So they've added this cool new feature that you're going to use every single day. And it really simplifies things and makes things so much more productive. I've used it throughout both books because particularly for someone who's writing little snippets of code and you're trying to show off a particular thing, being able to just say, right, here is a block of text that we've got some data that we're going to work on, makes it so much easier for the reader to read, it's nice and clean, and obviously for the developers to use as well. So great little new features in the language or the libraries, that motivates me, and these bigger new features like .NET MAUI. That's what keeps me coming back. There's always something new to learn every year.
So you kind of mentioned that there's always something new happening with .NET, and there's always new things being released. You've been doing this for a couple of years now, you keep coming back to it. So what have you learned in the process of writing all of these books since the first edition?
My time estimates, as much as I try to set sensible goals for both myself and the Packt team, because I'm always very conscious of having to hit deadlines, you always underestimate how long it's going to take to learn the new things, particularly because we have to work with the preview versions. So for example, with .NET 7, the first preview 1 came out in February 2022, and then every month we got a preview 2, preview 3, preview 4, etc. Up to preview 7, and then it switches to release candidates. Now during that time, Microsoft is, one of the fantastic things that Microsoft does is that they are developing the .NET platform transparently in the open. So all of the discussions, issues, new features that they're planning to add, it's all done. Anyone should just go to their GitHub repositories for .NET and read and participate in those discussions. And so for a very long time, the .NET team and the C# compiler team have been thinking about introducing a new feature to make it easier and to reduce the amount of code that you have to write in order to do a very common task, which is to check for null values as parameters passed into a function. And so they came up with this idea after many years of thinking about it very carefully of introducing a new operator, double question mark, that you would then decorate onto a parameter of a function and say, right, please write the null check handling for me. And they implemented that, they delivered it in one of those early previews. I was able to write about that topic in the book. And it was very interesting that the Microsoft teams, the .NET library writing teams, saved more than 10,000 lines of code, because then that little feature was then doing all that work for them. But all of the discussion was done in the open, and there was a lot of negative feedback, and eventually they decided, okay, we're going to remove that feature. And so one of the things that you have to learn as an author of these kind of technical books is that although you get access to these previews, you've got to always remember they are previews and anything could be taken away from you again. I personally would have preferred if they'd left that in. I think it's any time that you add a language feature, you've got to be very, very careful. So I understand the team's decision, but it just seems a shame that if you want to use it, it would have been great. If you don't want to use it, if you don't like it, you don't have to use it. So I would have leant the other way, but I totally understand how the team decided, actually, yes, it's probably isn't a perfect solution to that particular problem.
Great. So what do you think are the biggest challenges for .NET developers right now?
Well, it's an interesting time to be a .NET developer because not just the major shift from the .NET framework that was Windows only across to what was originally called .NET Core and now is just the one .NET, which is cross-platform. So we've had that major shift. What I see is now, and we've got to a very stable place. So .NET 5, .NET 6, .NET 7, you could kind of start with any of those and they're all so backwards compatible that you can build an application in .NET 5 and then migrate it pretty easily up to 6 and 7. And partly because of that, I would encourage .NET developers to go up to newer versions much quicker than maybe they used to. So embrace .NET 7 now. And your applications are going to be super easy to then upgrade to .NET 8. I would almost guarantee that. And so yes, the .NET platform itself has stabilized. The feature set is pretty much locked in, apart from, yes, some quality of life improvements like things like your raw literal strings. I can't see any major new features to the level of something like .NET MAUI or even Blazor coming in over the next couple of years. So now's a really good time to get into modern .NET or make that shift from .NET Framework to modern .NET. And so the new kind of trend, I would say, or the challenge for a .NET developer is to embrace some of these newer technologies which are commonly implemented cross-platform. So for example, in the olden days with .NET Framework, we had this technology called Windows Communication Foundation, or WCF, and that was really the preferred way of building a service, whether it's a REST service or whether it's a SOAP type service with XML, JSON, whatever kind of data format you're using to exchange. And that was a pretty fantastic technology. It had a steep learning curve, but once you get it, it was pretty good. But these days, Microsoft, first of all, chose not to then migrate that across to modern .NET. There is an open source solution, Core WCF, if you want to migrate your old WCF services. But really, the kind of modern way of doing things is to use a technology called gRPC. And that gives you the same kind of remote procedure call capabilities that you had with WCF, but it uses a much more efficient binary format for the messages. And it has a requirement on HTTP version 2, which is much more efficient for transmitting the messages as well between the service tiers. So if you're wanting to build microservices, if you're adopting, maybe shifting from a monolithic architecture to a microservice-based architecture, you're going to have more layers, more communication between all of these little broken down little sets of functionality, and therefore the overhead of any communication between those tiers or layers then could become a bottleneck. And using a modern technology like gRPC is therefore vital to maintain that kind of performance and scalability out of your microservices. And that's just one of the newer technologies. And there are a whole bunch of others that .NET developers have probably heard about. Maybe they've, because you're busy with your day job, you've got things to do, you go home, you might want to learn about some new technology in the evenings or the weekends, but you've got the kids to feed, the dog to walk. It can be really tough to keep up to date. So what you're looking for is some way to get started with all of these modern things. So you've got technologies like Signaler. That is a built-in part of ASP.NET Core, including the latest version, ASP.NET Core 7, and that allows you to add real-time communication, particularly to any kind of web application. So if you're having to update stock pricing on your website, on a dashboard, something like that, or build a live chat system, then you're going to want to use a technology like SignalR. But it is, in some ways, very similar to gRPC, because it's all about exchanging messages between different components of your application. But then you've got the traditional REST style, representational state transfer, designed by Roy Fielding back in 2001, which is all based on the HTTP protocol. That's a very open, very flexible way of building services. ASP.NET Core 6 and 7 introduced minimal APIs, which simplifies the way that you can build those kind of REST APIs. And you've got things like GraphQL. And so you've got all these different new terms. Often as an experienced professional .NET developer, you've heard of them, maybe you've read an article, but you need a bit more. You need to be taught the core important concepts for each of those service technologies. You need to know how to install and set it up, and then build a simple implementation. So that when the boss then comes to you and says, do you think we should use GraphQL or gRPC or SignalR, you'll at least have that experience. You'll have implemented it, you'll have seen it working. You'll know some of the pros and cons and the benefits and costs of each of those technologies, and at least you can make a good contribution to the discussion. And then once a decision is made, right, we're going to go for gRPC to implement this suite of microservices, then you could maybe turn to the documentation because you're already comfortable. Walk through building a simple, you've set up your proto files to configure the message format, you've implemented it, and you're going to know potentially the things that might trip you up, things to watch out for, even if you don't know all the details. And then that's when you can turn to the official documentation because you're already feeling comfortable, yes, I know at least how to get started with these technologies and to pick maybe the best one for a solution.
Brilliant. So you made a conscious decision to write 2 books instead of 1 for this particular edition. Why is that, and what are the differences between them?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, why have I written 2 books? It's basically because there is so much that I want to include in my books, so many new technologies, shifts in the trends for a .NET developer, so much to cover. But I don't want to force my readers to then buy a big, expensive 1,500 page book. I want to give my readers a choice because I know that I have some very loyal readers who have been buying my early editions. And so at this point, particularly if they bought last year's .NET 6 edition, they are pretty much now up to speed. Although there are some new features in .NET 7 and C# 11, they may feel that they want something more. And that's where this second book comes in. So it really does pick up from where the first book ends off. So the first book, C# 11 and .NET 7, modern cross-platform development fundamentals. And that's literally what it's about. It's the fundamentals of the language, the C# language, the .NET libraries, so little components like Lego bricks that you can then plug together to do things like access the file system or talk to a database or implement a regular expression to do some validation, all of those libraries, and then introduces you to the fundamentals of web development because that is the most common type of application that .NET developers want to create using ASP.NET Core 7. So that first book covers the fundamentals, language libraries, and web development. And for a student who's just getting started or a hobbyist, that's sometimes all they need. They don't need enterprise level technologies like gRPC. And so that's where this second book comes in, apps and services with .NET 7. That one will then continue your journey. I start by looking at data storage. So there are 2 important types of data storage that any .NET developer have to interact with. And that's your classical relational database. And so we have a massive chapter on SQL Server. And we cover things like not just the usual entity framework core, which is your object relational mapping layer. That's every book tends to cover that. But I also then almost go back in time a bit to actually how would you efficiently work with SQL Server? And that's to use the old, what used to be called ADO.NET, or the SQL client. Because if you've got your stored procedures already written and in the database itself, you just want to be able to execute that and get the data back out. SQL data reader, great, super fast. And that's actually being used by EF Core underneath anyway. So why not just go straight to that? So you learn both of those. So that's your kind of relational database with SQL Server. We also got another big chapter on Azure Cosmos DB. So that's your cloud data storage. And this is something that I think a lot of .NET developers are less familiar with. And so what they want is to learn a bit about, well, what are some of the key concepts around this cloud database? Why is it sometimes better than a relational database? Why is it often cheaper? Why is it often faster? Why is it more scalable? And let's actually see how it works. And so I actually cover 2 different APIs for working with Cosmos DB. You've got the classic SQL, what's sometimes called the core API, and that you will see once you read that chapter is very similar. You'll be able to leverage all the skills from SQL Server to work with cloud data storage while getting all the benefits of cloud data storage. But I also then, almost as a kind of very different way of working with cloud storage, cover Gremlin API, which is a graph database. Now, how many of my readers are actually going to need to implement that? I don't know, maybe not that many, but I think they're going to find it very cool and open their eyes and think about data storage in different ways. So 2 big chapters on data storage. Then we dive into some libraries, some more specialized libraries. So in the fundamentals book, I cover the really important libraries, file system, databases, and so on. In this book, we then go a bit more specialized. So if you want to get maximum performance, how do you do multitasking? How do you benchmark your code? It's all very well reading a blog article that says, oh, if you do this, you'll get better performance. But will you? Will it actually affect your application? Or is it just changing one small part of your application? Instead of taking 10 nanoseconds, it now takes 5 nanoseconds. And well, was that even worth it? So being able to benchmark your code, implement multitasking, dealing with shared resources and thread safety, there's a chapter on that. Chapter on working with dates and times and internationalization. So localizing the user interface into different human languages, handling time zones, one of the trickiest things that any app developer has to deal with, a bit of a nightmare all over the world, time zones, but we go into that kind of specialized libraries. And then lots of chapters on the services. So we cover REST style web services with minimal API, because that's the newer way of doing it, can simplify things. You don't have to create a controller. For those of you who have built web APIs before, we have GraphQL. We have an extension of the web APIs using something called OData, or Open Data Protocol. Makes it super easy to then build a web service that wraps up a data model. And then we have the gRPC, very efficient microservices, Azure Functions for building nano services or serverless services, so you can really reduce your costs, and SignalR for the real-time broadcast. And then we end the book with 3 different ways of building a graphic application. So we review ASP.NET Core and the Razor syntax. I go into a bit more depth on Bootstrap and how that's commonly used to build prototypes, particularly for ASP.NET developers. And that leads quite nicely into building Blazor components using WebAssembly. So that was, again, a fairly newish technology, with first introduced with .NET 5, but it's an area where the .NET teams or ASP.NET Core team has really been making massive progress over the last couple of editions, really adding some really great, well-supported features so that they can catch up with alternatives like React and Angular. So Blazor is a very mature technology now. If you've been avoiding it because you want to wait for it to settle down, I think it's ready now. Go for it. And then we end with .NET MAUI. So this is the evolution of Xamarin Forms, but where Xamarin Forms was limited to being cross-platform between mobile devices, iPhone and Android primarily, this now expands. .NET MAUI now also covers desktop, so you can create Windows applications and Mac OS applications. And of course, to do that, you need to be able to use native features of those platforms. So some of the newer things in .NET MAUI that you've never had in Xamarin Forms are things like being able to integrate with the menu system. In a desktop application, you're going to want to have a menu, and you're going to want to be able to right-click and see context menus and integrate with the notification system and all this kind of stuff. So of course, I've created 2 chapters on .NET MAUI in the Apps and Services with .NET book, so that you will get introduced to how to build a single application. You'll run it on Windows, you'll run it on Android. If you've got a Mac, then you can use that build process and deploy it to iOS as well, and Mac Catalyst in order to run it as a desktop Mac app. And then the second chapter on .NET MAUI covers a lot of the native integrations. So there's more, I think Microsoft used to call it lighting up your application by really integrating properly with the OS that it's running on, the platform that it's running on. So yeah, so much in this new book. I think .NET developers are going to be very pleased at the breadth that they're going to, of topics that they're going to learn about in this second book.
So both of these books, they mostly focus on the breadth. You don't go into any single concept super deeply. Is that correct?
Everyone these days has a LinkedIn profile, an account, and one of the most common things that kind of pops up in your feed will be a mind map of what a .NET developer, or whatever the topic is, what they need to learn. And you've got about 50 different blobs all connected together. Now, if you were to go through and search on a bookseller's website for all of those technologies, you'd end up spending $500 on about 20 books. Well, you can get that from me with my 2 books. So no, it doesn't go into the depth that those other books will do, but it will take you to the point where you're going to feel comfortable and confident that you understand the key concepts. You know, what is this technology? Why would I normally use it? What are its pros and cons? You will have written some code and got it working yourself. So any requirements that it has, installing packages or installing some command line tools that it needs, you'll have done that, and you'll have done a basic implementation. And so at that point, I think you will know enough that when you look at the documentation, you won't just get lost, or you won't waste a day getting nowhere, because you'll have already got started. And so you could just use the documentation at that point. Or yes, there are some excellent books by fellow authors who go into a lot of these topics in a lot more depth. But I think if there are multiple topics that you think that you want to know about, and there are some topics that you didn't really think you want to know about, but I think you'll find that by completing every chapter in the Apps and Services with .NET book, you will actually gain a lot.
If you had to think about a couple of things that readers will be able to take away from these books, what will they be able to do after they've finished reading them?
Yeah, so at the end of the Fundamentals book, it's the C# and .NET Modern Cross-Platform Development Fundamentals book, they will be able to build web applications. They'll be able to, so websites. They can choose to use either Razor Pages, which is a nice easy way of building kind of dynamic web pages, or the slightly more professional for bigger, more complex websites using MVC, Model View Controller. And in fact, even in the Fundamentals book, I've made sure to include Blazor. And so you'll learn 3 kind of web technologies for building a website, as well as, of course, the core .NET libraries and the language. So that gives you a really great foundation to either continue your programming career or maybe go off in some other different direction. Perhaps you've learned some other language like Python, or maybe you're not a programmer, but you're just curious. That's a great book to start with, because you do actually get to end up at the end of the book having built some actually useful applications. The newer book, the Apps and Services with .NET 7 book, this one you'll be able to have meetings with your boss, and when they say, you know, what do you think about SignalR, or what do you think about gRPC, you'll actually be able to answer with confidence and describe what you actually think about it and say, yeah, I've implemented that, I can have a go at that. And then you might be given the lead of that project to then actually, okay, right, go and build a prototype using that technology.
So how has your journey with Packt been so far, and what advice would you give to future budding or prospective authors?
What advice would I give to budding authors? Yes, so I have had a very successful career with my authoring with Packt. I've been lucky perhaps with the teams that I've worked with, but I actually suspect that any of the teams at Packt are actually pretty great. When I started authoring books with Packt, I had a full-time job. And so it was evenings and weekends when I was therefore writing all the chapters and doing editing and et cetera, with that book. And then more recently, as the book or the content of the book grew, I had to spend more time. And so I actually negotiated with my employer to go down to a 4-day week. And that I actually loved. I'd recommend anyone, if you're currently doing 5 days, it really works quite nicely. Having that day for your own projects, whether it's family or travel or whatever, I used it for these kind of projects, writing these books. I found that fantastic. Yeah, I wish that everyone had the opportunity to work a 4-day week while still earning the same salary, although I actually was paid 80%. But that worked quite well for me. And with the success of the 6th edition, and with lots of savings, I have now been able to, just a couple of months ago in August 2022, been able to quit that job, and I'm now with the 2 books going to be focusing certainly for the next year on just writing those 2 books, a full-time job, which I know I'm very privileged to be able to do. Most authors would not be able to get to that position. And the advice is as supportive. The Packt teams are very supportive, they are very professional, but my main piece of advice would be to say, don't just sit back passively. You are the author. Act like it. It's your book. It's literally, for my books and most of the Packt authors, it's your face on the cover, it's your name on the cover. If you're not happy with something, you've got to get it done yourself. And that can mean a lot of work, but I personally, even beyond the financial reward, I found it very, very rewarding. In those early editions, when it was kind of a little bit of extra money, okay, I could afford to buy the new iPhone that year, but nothing beyond that. It was the satisfaction of being able to hold in your hand a paper copy of something that you created. It was your baby. And that is very satisfying, and it does give you credibility with colleagues. And so if you are a, say, freelance consultant, or you're trying to build a name or a reputation, I do think that writing a book is a good way of doing that. And if you go into it with that attitude that you are going to be proud of the end result, that you are not doing it based on any particular royalties, don't have any expectations of high royalties. It's not easy. It is very hard work, particularly if you are going to do what I think is needed in not just waiting for someone else to fix an issue or to do some work, but actually make sure that you get it done yourself. Then I think it can be very, very rewarding. And I've been very happy with Packt as a partner. And I do consider Packt to be a partner, a very professional partner, reliable partner. And yes, over the years, I've worked with different individuals and teams within Packt, and every single producer and editor has been pretty marvelous and makes me look good. And I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that.